webcast is also, we've invited your finance officers, and we also have, I think, our representatives from some of our K groups, the co-op directors, and I also think we've been inviting our friends from the Kentucky Non-Public School Commission, as well as several of the Catholic Diocese superintendents. They have found the information that we provide to you as superintendents useful because they are also following some of the same guidance as they continue closure of their schools due to the COVID-19. So we want to welcome them. Okay, if you've already looked over the PowerPoint, you'll know it's about a 30-page. We have a lot of information to cover. We will have plenty of time for questions, but this is very important information regarding finance, budget, and HR. And so I think you'll find it very beneficial, and you'll, of course, be able to use the information in the PowerPoint after the webcast is finished. Just briefly, we're going to cover an overview of the state budget that pertains to non-COVID-19 issues as well, because we know you want to hear about that. But then also, of course, talk about nutrition services and funding as related to COVID-19, review of the Federal CARES Act that will be sending millions of dollars to Kentucky and much needed relief, and how that might work, the review of the Federal Families First Act, and also, of course, some review and questions about Senate Bill 177, which is the COVID-19 Relief Act that was passed by the General Assembly related to school districts. And then, of course, we'll have ample time for question and answers. I'm going to turn this over to Associate Commissioner Robin Kinney, and she's going to guide us through.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I guess I would start out with a note of appreciation. I've heard Commissioner Brown talk to you before about really the remarkable job that was done by local school districts when the governor requested that we close our facilities in the traditional sense and move to an NTI instruction type model for our students. But I guess I would even emphasize it even more as I've thought over the last week or so about the incredible job that everyone's doing, about the things that you're taking care of and you're putting first with your districts. And that would be, you're taking care of instruction, which is really needed. You're taking care of the social and emotional, mental and physical health of your students, and also trying to support your staff. And all of that is to be commended. But I guess I would say also in the context of making sure that you've thought of all those things that first, and then the financial considerations that surround the secondary. Financial considerations are very important, and today's webcast, we intend to share with you the knowledge that we have right now about what's going on in the financial pieces and parts of the state and federal government as it relates to continuing operations for your districts. But just really want to commend you on your public servant's heart in trying to put those other things first and letting the finances kind of catch up later. We do have a very full agenda today, as Commissioner Brown has noted, and he shared with you some of the things that we're going to go over. I'm going to have, as the song goes, a little help from my friends. And so I know the last thing you want to do is listen to me talk for 2 hours. So I've engaged some of my staff in the Office of Finance and Operations to help me. So Tony, if I could ask you to move to the first agenda page on the slide. And I think Kevin's kind of gone over that a little bit, but so I'm not going to recap it, but the next slide actually has our agenda.
All right, hold on, I'm getting it up there.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Okay, so I'm not going to rehash this. Commissioner Brown kind of kicked us off with the topics we're going to cover. As you can see, it's a very aggressive agenda for today because each one of these we could talk for quite a bit of time. We're going to kind of fly through it fairly quickly, but we do have a lot to cover. So I know we do have the soapbox set up for your questions, and Tony will also help us as we moderate through that. If I can go to the next slide, please, Tony. Let's start and first talk about the current fiscal year, the fiscal year we're in. You know, of course, school districts have to wind down this school year, no matter how we're operating, whether it's remotely or in the building, we've got to wind down the fiscal year for fiscal year 20. SEEK payments for fiscal year 20 shall continue right on schedule. If you can remember back to March 1st, and that seems like a really long time ago right now, we actually did final SEEK determinations. And at that time, the General Assembly was in session, a little more than they are right now. And there were various ideas being thrown around at that time through the various, the governor's recommended budget, the House and the Senate, on what to do with SEEK lapse. SEEK lapse, according to House Bill 352, and that is our budget that is being considered at this point, actually requires that SEEK lapse to the general fund. If you remember, in the budget that we're currently operating, it was designated to be distributed through the transportation formula. If House Bill 352 stands as it is right now, that will not occur. It would actually lapse to the general fund instead. Tony, if you can go to the next slide, please. Let's talk about the executive branch budget. This is House Bill 352. It's going to take a little bit of effort on my part because I usually talk about the biennial budget. This time it's a little unusual because our budget is for fiscal year 21 only. It is a one-year budget. I think in considering all the events that are going on in our state, our nation, and our world right now, the legislative body has decided to just do a one-year budget rather than to rely upon really forecasts that were built before the coronavirus pandemic and all that it has brought to us in as far as economic circumstances. So right now, that budget, House Bill 352, is being considered by the governor. The governor has the opportunity on the budget to veto either line item or the full budget. And the General Assembly is actually scheduled to come back into session on April 14th to consider whether they will override any of the governor's veto. We have posted SEEK forecast at the link that I have provided on your screen there. And there are some other things that have to be considered as you look at forecasts going forward. We have already had some questions about communications with the Department of Revenue on property assessments. And Che Ritter from my staff is going to be joining us in just a moment, and he'll talk to you about those conversations with the Department of Revenue and how that impacts your dollars going forward. And then, of course, as Commissioner Brown said earlier in his remarks, Senate Bill 177, that also has provisions, I believe, in Section 11 regarding SEEK. And really the intention behind Senate Bill 177 in this regard is to really try to effectuate expectations so that districts have something that they can kind of use as they build their working budgets, expectations on what their AADA would look like and how that is used to calculate SEEK for the next year. So under Senate Bill 177, 2018 and 2019 attendance data will be used to calculate the AADA used in calculating SEEK and any other state funding based in whole or part on average daily attendance. Next slide, if I can ask Che Ritter from my staff to now jump on. And Che's going to walk us a little bit more thoroughly through the fiscal year 21 SEEK information.
Good afternoon, everybody. Like Robin said, we're going to jump through SEEK for fiscal year 21. This will look very different than what we've done in years past, and I want to make sure that we go through this a little slower so you can see what the whole year will look like. In front of you, this is sort of our map of, SEEK forecast, SEEK tentative, and SEEK final. And forecast will start your payments in July, August, and September of this year. And then we'll switch over to tentative SEEK, which will run from September through March. And then final SEEK will post about March 1st of 2021. And this will be your final 3 months of payments. State budget is giving us $4,000 per pupil. As Robin said, it's a one-year budget, and this is what we know today. So 4,000 keeps us flat. But statewide equalization has been moved up to 916,000. And what that technically means is a lot of you all will see some differences in your state equalization for your nickels, including the FSPK. And you'll also see some adjustments in your tier 1 because they've moved this statewide equalization amount up. So as you'll notice in the forecast column, as Robin said, you'll see some data points where we're using 2018-19 data. This is what's currently showing in your FY20 SEEK. For example, your ADA, your at-risk, and your home hospital, and your transportation, which we just calculated March 1st, about a month ago. Then we're going to be using your district estimates like we always do for your property assessments and LEP students. We do have the exceptional child count from December 1st, so we're going to go ahead and plug that in, and this will give us our SEEK forecast, which should be posted here in just a second online. And months from now, when we get deeper into the year, once we start getting some additional data from the Department of Revenue and your LEP student data, we'll plug that into SEEK tentative about late September usually, and then that will start the cycle over again, and then we'll get into final SEEK, which we will include fall growth, as we always do, and January growth if funds are available. So yesterday, the Department of Revenue reached out to me and sent, we'll post these letters online so you can read them yourselves, but the short version is that the property assessments they believe will be delayed. And the way, after a conversation with the Department of Revenue, the delay actually impacts the counties more so than the school districts. We kind of look at this as a delay for us, which we usually start the tax calculations on July 25th. It looks like to us that it's going to move that up to about August 3rd, so a week or so later than usual, which is not bad considering that they're talking about a pretty long delay for the counties. As usual, we don't know which districts will come to us first with their property assessments from the Department of Revenue. So like we always do, we kind of play it by ear. And if we get 30 in a day, we'll calculate all those tax rates and send them out to you as quickly as possible. So you'll be able to set your rates and hopefully keep your collections in line with where you normally are. As we get a little closer to June, July, we'll be in constant contact with the Department of Revenue to see how things look at that time. If it looks like all the assessments are going to be available, pretty soon, we'll be able to run that through pretty quickly. Tony, if you could go to the next slide, please. And in the budget bill for the one-year budget, there's some language included that touches on some of the facility nickels. The one thing that's different this time is they did put a cap that no district will get equalization for more than 15 cents. This is basically if you've got 3 nickels, then they're going to cap your equalization at 3 equalizations, no more than 3. This is a little different than in years past. For the recallable nickel, we have several different groups. Those districts that have had the recallable nickel forever, you're still going to get equalized. And there was a group in the last budget that was getting equalized at 25%. Those are being moved to 100% equalization. And then we have a new batch of districts, and I think it's 8 districts that will be equalized at 25%. And then something else that's a little different in this budget is districts over the years that had the original growth nickel and or the equalized facility funding nickel that weren't equalized, those are now going to receive 25% equalization in this budget bill. And you can go ahead, Tony, go to the next slide, please. Thank you.
Shay, this is Robin.
Yes, ma'am.
We've had some questions in the soapbox. Can you address growth for a district and how that will work?
Sure. Can you go back 2 slides, Tony? Thank you. If you'll notice fall growth, we get that in typically in November, December. We start getting those numbers in, and then we'll finalize that growth factor in the fall. And we normally include that in with final SEEK. We expect that we'll run that process the same. So it will be a comparison of this fall versus last fall, just like it normally would be. And then January growth is it's usually, actually, technically it's more February and Marchish, but that one's always tied to if funding's available. If funding is available, we'll open that window just like we always do, and see how many districts qualify for January growth, and that'll be included in final SEEK, which would be March 1 of 2021. Does that answer the question, Robin?
Yes, I think it does.
Okay.
Also, if I can jump in, I see another question on the soapbox, which says, since the SEEK per pupil amount did not increase as projected, will there still be a mandated 1% raise for fiscal year 21? And there is not a required 1% raise from the annual budget for district staff or for state employees. Okay, we're going to roll through the rest of the budget. We'll continue to take your questions through Soapbox, and as applicable, I see some that are being asked about grant funds. So we have that a little later in the presentation, but I'm going to turn it over to Charlie Harmon. Charlie is our budget director here at the Department of Education, and he's going to walk us through some other important provisions of the annual budget.
Thank you, Robin. And I want to say hi and thanks to everybody for participating today. Take a few minutes to go over the highlights of House Bill 352. There's not as many as we had hoped for, but there are a few good things contained in here that districts will be happy to see. The first one is what you see on your screen right now, the school-based mental health services. It had been as high as $14 million in previous versions of the budget, but in this version, it contains $7,412,500, and it is to be used by districts to provide full-time equivalent positions for mental health services. This provision is going to be administered by the Kentucky Center for School Safety in consultation with the state school security marshal. And they're going to develop criteria on how to distribute this money. Mr. Akers at the Kentucky Center for School Safety, whom I'm sure worked with most of you, he's called us about 3 times a week, every week, keeping in great contact with us. And he works with Mr. Wilcox at the State School Security Marshal on a daily basis. There are some other criteria that's contained in the bill. A district must use their Medicaid funding, which I believe every district already does use all their Medicaid funding. There shall be an equitable balance, a statewide distribution for these funds, and any other criteria that the Kentucky Center for School Safety wants to include for trauma-informed approach to schools. All this is adapted to language from Senate Bill 1 from 2019. Thank you, Tony. There's also another provision. There is language provision that allows districts to modify their district facility plan without reconvening a local planning committee for the purpose of complying with 158-162. And so that's going to save districts time and effort in making changes to deal with the funding that's provided in this bill for security upgrades at the schools. So this allows you to get your board to vote on it, submit it to the department, and the department will also go ahead and approve that if there are no problems with it. This will save a lot of time for districts and a lot of effort. Additionally, this has remained constant in each version of the budget bill so far, is that there's $18 million of funding to be distributed to districts for this purpose. It had previously been part of the School Facilities Construction Commission, but now it's been put back in the department's budget. So we're not exactly sure the process to distribute this yet. We're going to work with SFCC, of course, and the Finance Cabinet on trying to do a distribution to districts with this money. There'll be a lot of questions, I'm sure, on how and why, and maybe even some recommendations, and we'd appreciate that, by the way. Tony, you can go ahead. Thank you. This is the large funding items, the grant items that are in the department's budget that we distribute to districts. You're all familiar with extended school services and Friskies and safe schools, Read to Achieve, preschool math achievement. Pretty much all of these funds remained the same in this bill as they were last time. So if you're relying on your ESS money to fund positions, you shouldn't have to worry about any changes in that. There are a couple new ones in here, and we did lose one that we had before, but there's not significant changes in our LARS grant funding. Okay, Tony. Here's some of the popular programs that are not funded. The ones that most districts get part of was the PD Flex Focus money. That was a large pot of money that districts received in the past, as well as Leadership and Mentor, Teacher Professional Growth, and Teachers Academy. And the ones that's fairly new to the department, KTIP and KPIP, are also not funded in this bill. I know it's been several years since there's been significant funding for those programs, but we still included them in our request and was hoping for funding for it. Thanks, Tony. High on everyone's priority is career and technical education. Pretty much funding for CTE has not changed for the department. There was a little bit of extra money put in the local vocational pot, and there was a funding that was provided for the normal operating expenses of the area technology centers. There is some language included that is different than has been in the past. There's been a few bills floated, and this has kind of taken some of the concepts that were floated in those bills on transferring an area technology center to a local school district. And there's always been some funding concerns from districts when they're interested in doing that. So this bill provides for, in year one of a transfer, you would receive 100% of the funding that is included in the department's budget for that area technology center. So if you had an area technology center in your district that was getting $500,000 of funding from the department, you would get $500,000 the first year you took control of that ATC. And in the second year, you would get 75%, so you would get $375,000. There is not any language about out years in year 3 and beyond. We're not exactly sure if there was any guidance that the legislature wanted in that. So, but this gives some concrete information on year 1 and year 2 if there were going to be any transfers from state ATC to local CTC. Okay, Tony. Thank you. There's also some other really good provisions for districts in this budget. There's been a lot of talk about the Volkswagen settlement money. This version of the bill, which is almost final, has $8.5 million in it for school districts to replace buses. It's at a 50% cost match. So if you get a bus that costs $100,000, this fund will pay for $50,000 of that. This program is administered by the Energy and Environment Cabinet, as they were the recipient of those funds in the lawsuit. So we're not sure the parameters exactly, but it's supposed to be for buses with chassis of 2001 or earlier. There could still be some of those on the road, but I know that usually you keep buses for 15 years usually. Local school district expenditure flexibility. This allows you to suspend some of the rules that require you to have a minimum reserve of 2%. They're trying to provide some, relief to districts in a tough fiscal time, as we've done a few times in the past. And this is something that you normally report to the department, and then they report to the Board of Education at every 2-month meeting. There's also some language about school building plan reviews and building inspections. This is something that the Department for Housing, Buildings, and Constructions recently, I think the statute allows for it to give that authority to local governments, the review of plans and inspections. And then recently, the Department for Housing, Buildings, and Constructions relinquished or took back that authority. And so this this language allows or requires districts and local governments to do that process on their own. It's believed that most districts can do this on their own and can do a good job of it and can do it a lot quicker and not have to worry with the backlog at the state level for Department for Housing, Buildings, and Construction. There's also some language that's, I think this is the second biennium that it's in there. It allows districts to flex out of our state grant programs and into their general operating expenses. I know that one of the finance officers had previously submitted that question. So it does allow that to happen. So unless that gets vetoed for some reason, we expect that to be available tool for the districts to use. Okay, so this is another slide that we've got around state and federal grants. So on all the federal grants, we're still awaiting guidance, official guidance on the current year projects or federal grants that we call Project E funds, which is just the year that's going to end in September. Finance officers know that. So we've got every indication that they're going to extend that, but we have not got an official notification yet. So we expect that to be approved and allow that maybe to go forth, maybe even another full year. So we'll see when that happens, when we get guidance from the federal government. Some dates that are important, the FY21 federal allocations, that's your next year's money, will be posted on our website in April. The FY21 consolidated GMAP application will open in May. We'll try to have that up as early in May as possible. The district funding assurances and the federal cash request assurances, those are the things that the superintendent signed, the board approved that you're submitted back to us. We'll have that stuff available in GMAP in mid-May. We'll do that as soon as the application gets opened. Some relief that we can provide for the finance staff in your districts. We're going to postpone the submission of the third quarter CDIP reports. So you all can, if you can do that and you have the ability to do that now, go ahead and submit those. If you need to wait through the summer in July, we don't have any big problem pushing that back till July for you. This is a question that was also submitted by a finance officer. We've got state grant funds that normally are spent during the school year that we're in right now. We have the ability with the governor's declaring a state of emergency that we're going to allow those funds to be spent over the summer and into next year. So we still want you to spend those funds, FY20 funds, before you get your FY21 funds. We don't want you to have a lot of tables open in Munis, but this will allow you to spend those FY20 down and then start your FY21 spending. So that shouldn't make you push things out and do a lot of journal vouchers over the summer. And then, of course, Robin's team has created, the department has created a COVID-19 website. We've got a landing page which will direct you to a finance page, and we've already got information out there populated on things that are being changed as required by the COVID-19 pandemic. Once again, we're trying to do everything in our power to make it easy on districts, as we always do. But there's a few things that, we can't waive federal requirements until we get some relief from them. If you have any questions, of course, we'll be here to answer them throughout this webinar, or if you submit them later, we'll be more than happy to get back with you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Charlie. This is Robin again. Before we move on to our next segment about school and community nutrition, we have several questions in the soapbox. So I want to try to get a few of those, and I'll ask Che or Charlie to jump in as appropriate. I think the number one question that we are seeing on the soapbox is about the use of the 18-19 attendance data and the language of Senate Bill 177. So that there has been some confusion around that and the ability of districts to kind of pick and choose which either 1819 or 1920. And it is our position that we all need to do the same thing. So it is permissible for us to use the 1819 school data for the ADA calculations, and that's the direction we're heading. Again, the objective from our end is to try to give as much predictability, not only for you as you manage your local school district budgets, but also for the SEEK appropriation as a whole. And allowing districts to pick and choose which years they're going to use to the benefit of the district could really cause some havoc for the allocation as a whole. So, Shay, do you want to add anything else about maybe some preliminary numbers you have run trying to kind of look at that issue?
Yeah, so Tony, if you can scroll back up to slide 5, please. So as we started the budget process many months ago, before any of the coronavirus was even a thought in our mind, the process was pretty normal. We came up with estimates that we believed over the next 2 years would be suitable for each district and statewide. And then, chaos hit, of course, and that sort of changed everything. So when we calculate forecasts, and we consider too, a big part of our consideration is when districts go to do their tentative budget, typically forecast and tentative, there can be quite a bit of fluctuation between the two because one's using district estimates and the other is actual data. So if you estimate, significantly incorrectly, you can see a large drop in your funding. So this will help stabilize SEEK on the front end. So when you do your tentative budget, SEEK is practically 75% finished at this point. The things will be changing, like LEP students for most districts. This is not a huge amount of funding. And then down the road growth, fall growth will add additional funds if they're available to your SEEK calculation. So we looked at that as a very big positive. So when we run the calculation based on the appropriation we got out of the 1-year budget, we're not flush with cash. We don't have a ton of cash left over to pay for growth, to pay for January growth. And to give you some context, we're within about 0.38% of our budget already, meaning that we have already, based on forecast, we've already spent up to that point. Now, the assessments as they come in from the Department of Revenue can impact that. As well as growth factor in the fall. If growth factor is huge or small, it will have an impact on that. So we're hopeful that the assessments come in at a pretty normal 3 and 4% or 2.5 or so statewide, an increase, and that will help bring in some cushion for fall growth, which we'll know about, like I said earlier, later in the year.
Thank you, Che. We have a couple of other questions on the soapbox. One is, what is the status of CETS funding for fiscal year 2021? Charlie, do you want to take that one?
Sure. CETS funding was remained constant. There was the same amount of money for CETS in this House Bill 352 as there is in the current year in House Bill 200.
Thank you. We also have a question about the Volkswagen funds. The question is, will the Volkswagen funds be competitive? And I think under the Volkswagen settlement agreement, those funds are allocated to the Energy and Environment Cabinet, and they will actually handle the process of distribution of those funds. So we'll be working with them, but they will actually manage how that gets distributed. Let's see, we also have, is the community preschool grant still funded?
As the House Bill 352 stands today, there is no earmarks for the what we call the preschool partnership grants.
Okay, we have a few more. Let's see, trying to find some that we had multiple questions, multiple people asking about. We have had a few questions about construction projects, and whether districts should allow workers in the building if it's just punch list items. Of course, those construction projects are managed at your local level. We've heard all along guidance and direction from the governor and from the commissioner about social distancing and making sure that we are practicing good measures as far as wearing masks has come out recently. So I think it's really at the discretion. I don't think we've received anything even from the Finance and Administration Cabinet. They are stopping construction projects, but we would encourage you to use those best practices just around social distancing and good hygiene overall. Okay, I think we have a few more that we will either get back to in the interest of time. We just want to make sure that we can get through all the materials. We're going to now go to school and community nutrition. Lauren Moore and her team have been working very, very hard over the last several weeks to engage all districts so that you can continue to provide food services to your students. Can't tell you how much I appreciate their hard work, just coordination and efforts and creative thinking. So I'm going to ask Lauren to kind of walk through a couple of slides, and then I know we've had several questions, especially over the last week, about continuation of this service and how we might collaborate together. So we'll talk a little bit about that after Lauren gets through a few slides.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you all for being here today. And I want to echo Robin's comments about all that you all have been doing to feed students during this time. I want to start with some just general information about child nutrition programs. I know you all had to switch very quickly from the traditional school meal programs that were available to support your staff or your students, and had to switch very quickly to different programs. The programs that we have currently are listed here: the Summer Food Service Program and the Seamless Summer Option. The majority of districts are currently operating under the Summer Food Service Program. And Tony, you can go to the next slide, please. The way funding is allocated in all of the federal child nutrition programs is through a meals times rate formula. And what this means is that districts submit the number of meals served each month and receive a set rate for each meal. Those rates are outlined here on this slide, and they are set annually by the USDA. We realize that participation right now is a factor when you projected your revenue for this year, and that you're likely seeing a decrease in participation and therefore a decrease in the funds that you projected for this year. It is also likely, and we've heard from many districts, that you're seeing an increase in expenses. So we currently have staff compiling information to reflect estimates for what you would have received in a typical situation for reimbursement versus what you are actually going to receive. We plan to do that for March, for April, and then we'll do that for future months as necessary as well. And you can go to the next slide. Thank you. Information included here is just a general reminder for the criteria to consider when you're determining what are allowable costs to the Food Service Fund. Also remember that emergency purchases are allowable through child nutrition programs. We have a process outlined that your food service directors are familiar with. We've actually received some requests already regarding how to request those emergency purchases. And then after receiving approval from our division, you would just need to ensure that you follow any other state or local procurement requirements that you have in place within your district. You can go to the next slide. This information includes types of expenditures that are allowable for the Summer Food Service Program. So as I said, most of our districts are participating in SFSP currently. The Seamless Summer Option, which we have a few districts participating in, those requirements are the same as the National School Lunch and School Breakfast Program. But this slide really outlines those allowable or unallowable costs specific to SFSP. The main question we've received so far, of course, is related to delivery expenses for meals. Delivery expenses are an allowable cost, meaning that reimbursement that's received with that meals times rate formula that we just went through is allowable through Fund 51. So there's no additional funds for those purposes, but the reimbursement that's received for that meals times rate purpose is allowable. Those delivery costs are allowable. So that would be things like fuel or driver costs. You would just want to ensure that if you do, for any expenditures paid against Fund 51, either initially or through a funds transfer, that you maintain documentation to demonstrate that those expenditures are allowable, and that's just for review purposes in the future. And that is all of the information on the slide. And I know Robin mentioned she's going to go through some of the potential shifts that you may need to be undergoing right now in your meal distribution. And I will just remind you, and I know there is the KDE COVID-19 site is through the PowerPoint a couple of times, but we sent some information out from our division yesterday to food service directors related to those shifts in meal distribution and different ways that you can ensure that social distancing while still providing meal service. And we've also updated that today. The information that went to the food service directors yesterday is now included on our KDE COVID-19 site.
Thank you, Lauren. I think really we just wanted to pause for just a minute and recognize that this is a really, really difficult area for school districts to be challenged with. You are on one hand really concerned about the health and safety of your school district staff, and rightfully so. And at the same time, you're trying to balance this request and need, quite frankly, for your students to continue to receive food services. So first of all, we acknowledge that that is a very difficult balance for you. Many of you in our eagerness to serve and very commendable eagerness to serve have adopted some models where we are going door to door for delivery, probably from a convenience standpoint on behalf of families. That is really great that you've been able to do that. And I do think it was necessary at a certain point. At this point, though, we have been talking on several superintendents' calls about just the sustainability of that model, and knowing that as you roll along and this takes longer and people are becoming ill, maybe that model is just not sustainable. So we would like to recommend here at the department that if you have not already done so, that you consider landing at a model that you do not have as much of that direct contact. It's a good thing for your staff and a good thing for the families and the students that you serve. The other thing I think that we continue to hear, and again, it's a credit to the admirable service that school districts being on the front line want to provide, is almost as if there's a desire or maybe even a feeling that you have to take care of this all by yourself. And so we would encourage you also to reach out through your community planning efforts with your county judge executive, your mayors, your community providers, maybe food banks, to also explore other partners that may be able to help with this effort. It's a huge challenge. It's necessary, and it needs to continue in some manner, but maybe just not exactly the manner that all districts have tried to achieve. We also know, and our sympathies and condolences go out to the family members in the district of staff that we have lost already to the coronavirus. And so it is trying to keep up that very admirable delivery of services and also protect staff to the degree that we can. So we would encourage you to adopt a model like that. You have our support. It doesn't have to be door to door. We're seeing lots of creative ways to do that. I saw something, I think, on Twitter last night where a district had worked with their community to encourage that tubs be placed at the end of the driveway so that when delivery was happening, they could put the meals in a tub. There are lots of creative efforts, tables being set up at sites, again, emphasizing that minimal amount of contact. But we want you to know that we support your efforts, and maybe it's time to make an adjustment at this point in time if you haven't already done so. So again, thank you to Lauren and her team who've done a really wonderful job, as well as all of the bus drivers and the volunteers, the staff, the food service directors. They have done a yeoman's job already, and we appreciate so much their efforts. If we can go to the next slide now, Tony. I'm going to check the soapbox here real quick. Lauren, I think we did have one question about CEP. If I can find it here. Excuse me for just a minute. Lauren and Che, if I can find the question. Well, I'm having a hard time. We've got a lot of activity on Soapbox, but we will get you a written response to your CEP question. Okay. So next we're going to turn and talk about some new federal legislation that you've probably heard things about. And again, what our goal today is to really talk to you about some opportunities for funding that are available, that will be coming, and to give you kind of an expectation of when we might see some of this relief coming our way, and how you might be able to use some of this funding in this very uncertain time. I'm going to turn my camera off so I can now speak to you from the slides. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or better known as the CARES Act, provides relief to states. I'm really just going to focus today on a couple of components of the CARES Act. It is an enormous bill, about 900 pages long. It provides relief across lots of sectors, across state government, influencing businesses and government sectors, as well as individuals. But we're going to focus today on the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund and the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. We're also going to talk for just a few minutes about FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Act, and some important information that I want to share with you about FEMA. And then finally, we're going to talk about the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act, which really talks in our context about some additional leave for employees, both sick leave and emergency FMLA leave that is available for our employees. Tony, if you can go to the next slide, please. The CARES Act passed very recently, went into effect on March 27th, sets forth an education stabilization fund of about $30.75 billion. From that, we have the Governor's Emergency Education Relief, and these are national numbers that I have on the screen right now. $2.9 billion, $13.2 billion in the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, and another $13.9 billion for the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. Again, those are national figures. Next slide. The CARES Act, the $13.2 billion, from that, Kentucky, our estimate that we have received to date from the Congressional Research Service, we do not have yet our formal notice of award, but we are projecting $193,187,000 to come to Kentucky for this specific relief fund. There are the criteria set forth on the screen. 90%, at least 90% of this funding will be distributed to local school districts by the Title I formula. The state agency may reserve up to 10% for grants and statewide emergency needs, and it shows the small percentage that can be reserved for administration. The way the funds will flow under this relief fund, USDA must issue a notice inviting applications from the state agencies within 30 days from the date of enactment. And then the USDA is required to approve applications within 30 days. We have heard strong encouragement by SEAs across the nation, as well as our good educational partners, really encouraging USED to invite those applications very quickly and to approve those applications very quickly. We understand that, you know, districts need this money coming to them at a fast pace, and so we are really advocating that that comes to us very, very soon. In Kentucky, all districts are Title I, and so all districts will receive some amount from this. Next slide. In trying to give you good information to allow you as you plan for your working budgets right now, we have estimated that about 83% of what districts received in fiscal year 2019 under Title 1A is about what LEAs will receive from this relief fund. So we have included in the PowerPoint the Title I grant awards, the prior grant awards, so that you can quickly look at what you received previously and then do the math to get about 83%. And the reason we say about 83% is we are still, the department is still considering whether the state agency will avail itself of the 10% that is allowed to stay with the state agency. So we're basing that 83% so that it sort of gives you a base, and then there could be opportunities for more money to flow to the district level. Next slide, please. The CARES Act gives broad local authority and discretion on expenditures for the funds once they are received by the LEA. It includes any activities authorized under federal programs already, and those are listed there on your slide. So anything that you could have spent under one of those programs, you can spend CARES Act dollars going forward. And then there's also a list of some examples of other things that you could use your CARES Act money for expenditures. And those are really more tied to the direct impact of the coronavirus and additional expenses that districts are incurring. That is not exhaustive, and I know that I have already been receiving information from finance officers of costs that districts are incurring in addition to the ones you see on your screen. We understand that you have additional postage costs, you have paper costs, copier costs, increases for boxes and bags and other distribution methods. So there's lots of expenditures that districts are incurring right now that we think would fall into the bucket of other things directly tied to the coronavirus. I guess the one thing that I would say about the use of your funds, as with other prior relief funds that have been distributed, if you can think back to maybe the ERA distribution of federal funds, there is a recommendation that districts would not use these funds for recurring ongoing costs, such as salaries, because as we know, when relief funds come, at some point they go away. And so we would rather encourage one-time expenditures for the funds. So one of the things, education technology purchases, if you have the need for more ed tech, one-time costs, that would be appropriate. But we would caution against expenditures for continuing salaries that would go on after the relief fund would be exhausted. Next slide, please. There is also, as part of the CARES Act, a separate pot of money. It's the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. Kentucky's estimated award is about $43.795 million. Again, that's based upon what we know from the Congressional Research Service. This is under the purview of the governor's office in each state and is tied to determinations either by the SEA for LEAs that have been identified as most significantly impacted by the coronavirus, or it could be used for institutes of higher education. So we are in conversations with the governor's office, the office of the state budget director, and the cabinet on this additional pot of money, and we'll have to provide additional information on how that will be allocated in the future. Next slide, please. As part of the CARES Act, additionally, there are funding flexibilities. It was announced on April 6th and permits an application for waiver of various provisions, including carryover provisions, availability of prior fiscal year funds, restrictions on technology infrastructure across the various programs that are listed on slide 24. Kentucky has already submitted our waiver request. We've asked for the maximum amount of flexibility in every area we can. We have the U.S. Department of Education. We're very appreciative that they made a very, very simple way for us to request a waiver request. And we have already received a response back. I think we sent it last night, and we've already gotten a response back of a tentative approval of our waiver request. So really good turnaround time. Really appreciate the additional flexibility from USAID. Next slide, please. So we are still awaiting guidance from USDA on several things related to the CARES Act. We have already asked questions on behalf of all local districts. What about pre-award costs that were incurred by districts before the date of March 27th, which was the effective date of the act? And while we have received optimism that pre-award costs may go back to another date, we don't have that yet. So that is one outstanding question about costs that have been incurred prior to March 27th. Likewise, what about expended state and local funds that you've already shown and coded, and now do we have to recode those? We will be sending forth guidance and direction from District Support Services on how we're going to code all the funds related to the coronavirus pandemic. So that is something that we will provide to your finance officers and all your staff that work in the coding in Munis. Equitable services is a question that is also being discussed at USAID and in conjunction with our good partner at the Council for Chief State School Officers. Equitable services do apply, but we need a little more fleshing out of what does that mean in the context of the CARES Act. We talked briefly about significantly impacted, which is the language that is used in the governor's fund. What does it mean when the state is supposed to identify LEAs that have been significantly impacted by the coronavirus? Does that mean from a financial perspective? Does that mean from a health perspective? And so there's still much needed clarity around what that actually means for local school districts and for states. And then when we get to the last question, what about all the other funding gaps? I can imagine some of you are thinking, okay, now you're telling me that you've kind of walked me through the state and you've walked me through my budget as far as state resources, and you've told me a little bit about the CARES Act and what opportunities it might bring to districts for funding. But what if we still have funding gaps? How are we going to take care of that? Next slide, please. One other option that I want to share with you, and I'll get back to the question about other possible gaps, but again, our objective is to make sure that every available resource is tapped to the extent that it can be tapped. Because as we sit here today on April 7th, we still don't know all the costs that we're going to incur and how they neatly fit into each box where we know that their funding exists. So let me spend just a minute talking about FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And many of you may be familiar in working with FEMA in the past for an ice storm or a tornado or those types of disasters. And let me say, the catastrophe of the coronavirus is one that is different from all the rest. But FEMA will be providing assistance to eligible applicants, and they are still working through what that looks like in the context of the coronavirus. In my discussions with the Kentucky Emergency Management Office, they have encouraged me to advise local school districts to please fill out a request for public assistance form. So you'll see on slide 26 a reference to that public assistance form where you can locate it. I think it is a one-page document. It is not very extensive. And once you complete that, please send it to the Recovery Branch email at the email box that's listed on slide 26 as well. The deadline is April 13th of 2020. And at this time, your request for public assistance, you don't need to identify what so much that you think you are eligible for. It is basically to get your application in the queue so that they can understand that you might be seeking assistance in the future. I've also included the contact name of Ms. Jessica Mitchell. She can also answer any questions about the form. I will share with you that they're very, very busy people, just like we are very, very busy people right now. And so I would, if you can also send an email to her at the same Recovery Branch email, if that is a more convenient way for you to go forth. But we provide this as another possible option that may make resources, either financial or otherwise, available to local school districts, and we just don't want you to miss out on that opportunity. Next slide, please. Finally, we're going to go into the discussion now about leave and how leave works. There's been lots of questions about the layers of leave for local school district employees. And let me start by saying the best authoritative resource for the new federal leave provisions is the U.S. Department of Labor. And I have included in this slide the kind of the U.S. Department of Labor website. And then if I can also quickly go to my camera to show you the second link on this page is a document. It's called the Families First Coronavirus Response Act Questions and Answers. It is the best document that I have found so far that really tries to go into a lot of the questions that we are all collectively struggling with. In addition to you as local school districts, we here at Kentucky State Government are also trying to learn about the nuances of all the different types of leave. So the U.S. Department of Labor is the authoritative source. They have lots of really good questions and answers from both an employer and an employee perspective. I would encourage you very much to consult with your local board attorney and your district human resources professionals with individual staffing questions. They are the ones that are boots on the ground and know individual facts about your employees, because which leave to use and when to use it becomes fact specific at times. And so it's really important that you, because you know your employers employees and their situation the best, that you are relying upon your district human resources professionals. Local school board policies, KSBA has also put out some good guidance. And so I would also encourage you to look at their guidance as well. And the thing about the frequently asked questions from the Department of Labor, they answer questions like, how do I determine who is eligible? How do I determine what regular hours mean? How do I determine rate of pay, and how the emergency sick and emergency FMLA work together? What kind of records do I need to keep when an employee takes leave? What about telework? I mean, how does telework fit into this discussion with this new category of emergency leave? What about online instruction? There's some provisions in the Families First Act that talks about being able to take care of a child and childcare needs. How does that work if we're utilizing NTI days? So lots of really, really good information from that site that are listed on slide 27, the frequently asked questions from there. Tony, next slide, please. At the highest level, the Families First Act, which is effective from April 1st, 2020, and applies to leave taken from April 1st, 2020 through December 31st, 2020. And I note this particularly because there are other leave provisions when we get to talking about Senate Bill 177 to distinguish, because it has a different time period. And so I think it is important that we understand the nuances of when the Families First Act applies and when Senate Bill 177 applies. Very high level, the Families First Act talks about sick leave, and it talks about paid sick leave, I should say, paid sick leave, and paid expanded family and medical leave. And you'll see up on the screen kind of the provisions. For the sick leave, it is available to all school district employees, and that's full-time or part-time. And child care, those are for kids under 18 whose school or child care is closed. And that's where I was talking about how it does apply if you are in an NTI situation and you have kids at home. Under the definition of closed, NTI is still closed. So I would note that as well. For expanded family and medical leave, that is for employees who have been employed at least 30 days. And it is tied to the need for childcare. It's extra days under that provision. Next slide, please. If you'll contrast that, the new leave at the federal level, and we've had a lot of questions about Senate Bill 177 emergency leave. If you'll note in Senate Bill 177, it talks about during the 1920 school year. I think that's the distinction that I wanted to note between the previous Families First and the timing for the emergency leave in 177. It's also important that this leave is not automatic. I know we've had lots of employees asking questions of their board and of their district. I would like to utilize emergency leave under Senate Bill 177. It is not automatic. It requires the local board to determine if it's necessary to grant emergency leave to any full or part-time employee in relation to the COVID-19 public health emergency. So that is an extra step. And there is no limit on the number of days under the emergency leave of Senate Bill 177. For emergency leave under this provision, no personal affidavit is required from the employee. And again, we've stated it requires local board action. So I'm going to stop at that point, and looks like we got lots of questions. I was trying to get through a lot of these before we went back to our questions, and now we're going to flip back. Tony's going to help me with questions because I've been presenting. But go back to the soapbox. While I get back there, Tony, do you want to throw out a couple of questions?
Yep, sure. Let me just unshare that. And let's see what we have. All right, was it mentioned that in House Bill 352 that there is more funding for locally funded CTCs? And I apologize, was that already addressed? That was the first one that popped up.
Yes, there was. For the $11 million pot, they added $200,000. So it takes it just over $12 million total.
Okay. Will the Title I funds you mentioned be in addition to regular Title I funding?
So under the CARES Act, the manner of distribution of funds is through the Title I formula, but you do not have to use them within the constraints of Title I programmatic expectations. It is much broader that you can use those funds more broadly than Title I.
Okay, and since the SEEK per pupil amount did not increase as projected, will there still be a mandated 1% raise for fiscal year 21?
So I think we addressed that one already. There is no required salary increase from the state from House Bill 352. So districts can make that local decision as they have in the past, but it's not required from the state.
Okay, please answer the question about using 1920 numbers instead of 1819 if it benefits a district.
I think we already answered that question.
Okay. It's a lot of similar questions here. Sorry.
That's okay.
Let me keep going here. With FEMA being available for emergency purchases, is it restricted to food service summer feeding?
Again, on the FEMA application, they have not yet determined what will be eligible expenses. I think that's a really good question for districts to ask whether, because typically FEMA is used for preservation of property, it is for health and safety, those types of reasons. So I do think that is a good question for us to ask collectively of FEMA, if maybe some of those gaps that we see in the food service areas could be something that could be an eligible expenditure. So we will note that on behalf of all districts and ask that question of emergency management.
Do you recommend blanket non-renewals due to uncertainty in the fall?
I don't think we would recommend blanket non-approvals. Again, we think that is a district decision.
Okay. Since SBDM councils already have their allocations based on board-approved staffing formulas, are you suggesting we go back to boards and change the staffing formulas and redo SBDM staffing allocations? They're concerned about just cutting positions.
Might need a little help for my SBDM friends on that one. Why don't we take that question and we'll work SBDM staff in Kelly Foster's office and get a question and answer back on that one.
Okay,
Hey, Kelly, I'm on here.
Hey, Kelly.
So I think it would depend. I mean, have allocations changed from your board during this? But we'll put that question down and we'll send you back some scenarios.
Okay, I have marked that one on here for it. Would FEMA be used to pay for overtime instead of the CARES Act due to the fact that they would not have occurred otherwise?
Again, when it relates to FEMA, we just don't have sufficient guidance at this point with FEMA. This is kind of uncharted territory for them. But I think anything that I raise that and offer that, hoping that districts will go ahead and fill out an application so that as we identify the gaps in funding, we can pursue expenditure relief from any source possible. So that's why I reach out and provide the FEMA information. It may or may not come to fruition that that is a good source for us. I just would hate for us to lose that opportunity if there is any hope at all.
Okay, there's 2 questions as in response to the request for public assistance. The first one is, did you participate in the federal state preliminary damage assessment PDA? Is that a yes or a no? And then the second question is, it asks for a school or educational facility to attach information on accreditation or certification. Where do they get that?
We will provide information on again, I think what they're trying to do is make a one size fits all. On the accreditation or certification, we'll get you information on that. But we will continue to rely upon the guidance and direction from Ms. Mitchell and emergency management for the rest of the completion of the form.
Okay. All right, the comment says that their question was not necessarily answered. They want to know if the CARES money is in addition to their Title I's funding.
Yes, and I'm sorry if I misunderstood your question. CARES relief money is on top of other funds that you already receive from the federal government.
Okay, will districts be able to bill Medicaid for billable services provided non-special ed students, for non-special ed students? Is Greta on, maybe? Is that a Greta question?
No, that is a question under the Medicaid free care program, I believe. If that requester could send additional information around that quest so that we can better understand that question, but I think they may be referencing under Medicaid free care.
Okay. Looks like we have a question. Will KSBA be creating policies concerning SB 177 emergency leave and sending out to LEAs? You can certainly reach out. Go ahead if somebody wants to grab that. I was just going to say you can certainly reach out to KSBA on that to assist.
And
Go ahead.
KSBA, I think, has issued some guidance on that, but I'm not certain about the answer to the question about if they will be providing policies, sample policies. But we can certainly ask that.
To assist districts financially, do districts have the option to temporarily lay off non-essential support personnel, and they would be entitled to state and federal unemployment benefits?
While, you know, the employer-employee relationship is between the district and the employee, I think we have all really tried to maintain those employer-employee relationships to the degree possible. There was a question because in the CARES Act, there's actually language in there that talks about really wanting districts, LEAs to continue to maintain that relationship with their employees. But I don't think that is a requirement for funding. I think it is an expression of aspiration that really like those relationships to continue. Of course, sitting here in Frankfort, that's not a decision that I can make on behalf of local school districts, but we certainly would like to encourage you to continue with an expectation that funds will be coming to districts to try to maintain that relationship to the degree that you can.
Do we have a concern that state revenues will not meet the fiscal 21 established budget?
You know, I think that that is a concern only because of the uncertain times we're in. I don't think that we have we don't have a crystal ball. And as people that work in budgets, you never have a crystal ball. You kind of go on past history and trends and experience and what you know about how things work under normal circumstances. And we are as far removed from normal circumstances as we ever could be. So I think it is very difficult to predict what revenues will look like, how much money will come in, and how that will impact expenditures. But I can share with you that we'll all be right there together trying to figure it out. As the budget is built every biennium, there's a group of really smart people called the Consensus Forecasting Group that meets to help advise the executive branch on a state and national level, looking at models and looking at what's happening in various sectors of the economic circumstances. And that group met as we prepared for this year's budget and gave their best information on what they thought would happen. And then the coronavirus came, and that, of course, put all that hard work into a different category. So I think we're all in uncharted territory, and it's possible. But I also know that as we work together along the way, we'll figure out a way as we see what revenues are coming in, how we manage through it together.
Okay. Are PVAs still assessing property as usual? Rumor was that PVAs could revert to 2019 values.
I'll pick that one up. As I said earlier, what we know now is these assessments will be delayed. I expect, and we've got some official letters from the Department of Revenue that we'll post on our website as well, so you can read through what they sent to PVAs, sheriffs, and clerks. That kind of explains the windows of assessments. But as far as we know, everything is just delayed. So we'll have actual assessments. It'll just be a little bit later than usual.
Will districts automatically receive 83% of their Title 1A funds and then be asked to submit proof of expense at a later date?
So right now, it is our best thinking right now. We really don't want to slow down the process of funds getting to local districts. So in some circumstances, we would require an application to be submitted by the district, and then a thoughtful budget to be put together, and you all thinking about and basically outlining eligible expenses for us. And at least right now, that's really not the path we're going to take. We want to get money to you as quickly as we can. So it will be important that you code your expenditures. And again, as I said earlier, we'll be giving you information about how to do that for your expenses. And then it is important to track it, because at the end of the day, we're going to want to know for purposes of making sure that we are expending those dollars in accordance with the CARES Act, but also use this as an opportunity to learn across the state how those funds were utilized for the benefit of districts, always trying to be in a lessons learned mode as we go through anything new and be able to report out how districts spent those funds for the benefit of their students. So we're not going to require something in advance. We will certainly be asked, as well as be interested in knowing how those dollars are expended at a later date.
Okay, if a district completes 1,062 hours of instruction as required, but the number of days is less than they had under contract, are those days credited and considered their contract fulfilled? So
I might be misunderstanding the question, but the 1062 is your instructional hours, separate and apart from contract hours. So there still would be an expectation that contract days are fulfilled.
Okay, will KDE be sending out a Q&A listing from the soapbox from today's session? I'll go ahead and answer that one. The answer is yes, and we will be sending out, this is recorded, so this entire video will be recorded and put up on our media portal. We will share it out as well, and we will also be updating a Q&A document from this webcast and also into our general Q&A listing. So unless Robin, you want to add something to that?
No, I mean, our goal is always to answer all the questions that are submitted so that we can all be sharing and learn from each other.
Do employees have to exhaust their sick days before being eligible for leave options?
Under the Family First Act, there are your usual sick leave days, but I do not think they have to exhaust those before they use the federal sick leave. I'm gonna ask, but we will look into that one just so that we're perfectly clear. I think one of the most confusing pieces of all the leave requirements is the priority and sequencing of those days and how you look at those. So let us circle back just to make perfectly sure on that. That's an important question.
Okay. Is there any consideration being given to the expected lower property tax receipts due to the fact that people are not going to be able to pay their tax bills, especially for those districts who are majority locally funded, perhaps not take the full 30-cent local effort?
Robin, I think I can answer that. As of now, I mean, that's something we're considering, but we don't have the authority to change the formula without legislative action. And they'll, allegedly be back in January, or if they do a special session. If we see poor collections, this is something that has to be addressed by the General Assembly.
Okay. Is there potential for districts to get additional CARES or governor's funding for the decrease in funding we will receive due to the state using 1819 numbers? Should I flag that one?
Yeah, let's flag that one.
Okay. All right. Will the CARES Act fund have a 27-month term for spending like the federal title programs?
I don't know that we know the answer to that. That was a question that we asked in our CCSSO meeting, the Council of Chief State School Officers, whether the tidings would apply. So we are still seeking guidance on that, but that is one question that we have asked on behalf of all school districts.
Will we be able to use money from the CARES Act to pay for overtime being submitted to COVID-19 expenses, things like technology and food service staff, transportation staff?
Again, the CARES Act is very broad. It allows you to pay for expenses associated with the coronavirus. If they are one-time expenditures, like overtime, that would probably be more likely to be allowed to be paid out of CARES Act rather than a reoccurring salary expense.
Okay, let's see. Is there any federal relief available to offset food service loss during this time?
As we've talked about throughout the presentation and in Lauren's presentation, from the USDA, there is not additional funds for the increases that districts are feeling from USDA funds. So our goal is to look at other resources that are potentially available to see if we could pay for some of those costs from somewhere else. The governor's emergency relief fund may be one option, but of course that has not yet been determined of how those funds will be allocated between state, LEAs, and institutes of higher education. So we will be crafting recommendations for consideration on the governor's emergency fund, but I don't have good final guidance on how that will be allocated right now.
And Robin and Tony, I would just add that that's why we've been repeating on various webcasts the importance of districts to continue to keep track of all of the additional expenses or things they think may be an additional expense, so that we can sort this out later. Best to keep track of it now, and then in hopes that we will have funding sources. We know we have funding sources to pay for some of these things. We just don't know yet the initial guidance has been, it's been going to be very broad, but you know, there could be some things. For example, it was brought up on the last webcast that whether or not money that districts are out because of canceled student trips. We're not sure about that yet, but go ahead and make sure you're keeping track of that.
All right, Kevin, there's a little bit of feedback when you're talking, just FYI on that. There's two questions here, and I think we've addressed this in the PowerPoint that I believe you all should have received about the Volkswagen settlement and the community school preschool grant being funded. And I believe that was addressed earlier in the webcast, and that should be addressed already, correct, Robin?
Yes, we answered those.
Okay. And then the next question is, so do we use current projected enrollment numbers for allocations?
I don't know which allocations we're referencing there. If the requester could kind of add to that question.
Okay. How will no transportation impact our transportation funding?
Could you repeat that question, Tony?
I can answer that. So one main reason we're looking at using 2018-19, which is used in the 1920 SEQ, which was just posted for transportation, is there's the formula for transportation is obviously complicated, but NTI days and the lack of student transportation, that is transporting pupils every day, would skew a lot of those numbers that are used to determine your funding and transportation. For example, your T codes, how much you spent on transporting pupils, your days transported. NTI really throws a monkey wrench into all that. And the fear is that these numbers, as they came in, if we pulled them in like we normally do, many districts would see, to me, a catastrophic drop in transportation funding. And it also ultimately impacts your tier 1 funding as well. So that's why, if you'll notice on the, I think it was slide 5 or 6, the transportation is going to use basically what you're currently getting right now. And we normally wouldn't calculate that until March, but we already have the numbers. So we're going to plug it into forecast and move forward with it.
All right, so this is another CARES funding question. Can it be spent on things that our high school seniors have missed out on, such as senior trips, proms, or possibly graduation?
I think we addressed that kind of when we talked about the cost for senior trips, that we just don't know the answer to that yet. So things they missed out on, I don't know how, if that might include deposits that were made on venues or anything like that. I think that's a good question for us to ask. Contractual obligations that maybe the district has incurred on behalf of their students that they can't recoup. That would be a good question for us to ask. I don't have the answer to that, but I think those are all good questions.
Okay.
I just wanted to also add, Tony, Robin, and Che, the answer about this transportation funding. We're going to work to make sure that it's not catastrophic for you. The goal is to try to work this out using working with the governor's office, using federal funds, and trying to do what we can. So we don't have answers yet, but the goal is that you come out of this without having any catastrophic effects on your financial operations. Now, having said that, are there going to be some effects? Probably, but the goal is for no district to have any kind of a catastrophic loss or effect because of COVID-19, and we're going to leverage everything we can to make that happen. So that's a pledge to you all from the department, and the governor's office has been very clear that they want to make sure we're leveraging all federal funds and flexibilities to the extent possible. That doesn't mean there won't be some negatives, but we want to make sure that it's not catastrophic.
Will the different types of leave discussed be the responsibility of the LEA, or will there be funds available to cover these types of leave?
Under the CARES Act, the Family First Act, if we can keep in mind that the Families First Act applies more, in addition to local school districts, it also applies to any employer who has less than 500 employees. And under that act, the way that employers that are in the private sector are, and I'll use the word compensated loosely, but are credited with the paid leave is through tax credits. So obviously in the public sector, we don't have anything like that. So even though it is required, and the public sector is required to follow those provisions and grant that leave, there is not a fund source directly tied to reimbursement of local school districts when you incur that cost. That's why it's important, as we learn about these other areas of funding opportunities, that, as Commissioner Brown has said, we kind of try to understand all the opportunities, all the fund sources that are available, and we may need to use bits and pieces across those opportunities to really get to a hold harmless status. But there's nothing in the Families First Act that allows for reimbursement of the amounts that are paid by public employers for those required leave requirements.
Okay. Looking up at, wanted to know if the PowerPoint can be shared with the financial officers, and the answer is yes. If it was not shared earlier, we will be getting that out again. So we'll get that out to you. The clarification on the, sorry, my screen just updated and I missed it there for a second. Well, the different types of leave, or no, I got that one already. Sorry, somebody keeps updating my screen. Would it be allowable to pay food service and bus drivers additional money to pay hazardous pay during this time?
So we've had some question about hazardous pay, and I think we want to be careful with that wording. I think that districts can do extra duty, but hazardous pay in the context of retirement means something completely different. So I don't think we want to necessarily call it hazardous pay, but I think it could be extra duty. I might have Todd Allen from our legal office chime in, or someone else. I just want us to be careful about how hazardous pay is sometimes viewed in the retirement context.
Okay, so the clarification, or Todd, did you want to answer that?
No, that's okay. I was going to ask you if you would repeat it, actually.
Oh, okay. Let me go back down there.
And while you're doing that, Tony, and I also think the governor has talked about folks, the bus drivers and food service workers and all the others involved in public health service being first responders. And that is true. And that is a term reflecting on their sacrifice and being willing to work. That does not necessarily bestow any kind of a legal status on them or an employment status. I think that may be where some of the confusion's coming in.
Okay, so the question was, would it be allowable to pay food service and bus drivers additional money to pay hazardous pay during this time?
Yes, I think I appreciate the clarification and restating the question. I think that Robin appropriately addressed that with the ability to look at paying for extra duties if those individuals are performing extra duties. Obviously, if they're hourly employees, then they're going to be paid for additional hours that they would work. But I agree that we should be cautious about referring to that as hazard duty. There are certain classes of employment across the Commonwealth of Kentucky, public employees who are considered to be hazardous duty, police officers, EMS workers. That means that they are in a separate retirement system, and the employer pays an additional cost above what employees in the regular Kentucky Employees Retirement System pays, and that status has to be conferred by the retirement system. So again, I think Robin is correct that we wouldn't call that hazard duty. We would look into compensating those individuals for additional duties that they've been assigned or additional hours that they're working.
Okay. Was the Frisky question addressed already? Coordinator, okay, so I'll go ahead and ask that question. I'm sorry, the screen moves. Our Frisky coordinators are being told that the regional coordinators are directing us to spend this year's Frisky budget with kids not in buildings. This will be tough, even with NTI. Will these funds be able to be carried over? And that was asked 20 times.
Robin, do you want me to answer that?
Yes, please.
So in all of the grants that are in the KDE budget, we've considered the time frame of the spending of those being removed, so you could use those in the second year. Although we had not considered Friskies, because although we get that money, we immediately transfer that money to the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. But I will double check on that this afternoon and we'll respond.
Okay, again, going up to the top with some of our most popular questions that people have marked. If we have already done all of the security upgrades, will we get reimbursed for those expenses over the last 2 years?
So that question has been asked before, and we're still awaiting guidance from the Governor's Office for Policy and Management, but we will post that answer as well.
Okay.
Tony, if I can jump in for a minute, I saw
Sure.
a comment that might be helpful for the group. Someone has posted, just as an FYI, that I assume this is a local district writing. I did not have to provide any type of accreditation paperwork to FEMA when I submitted my application. They do request your employer EIN number, so be sure to provide that in your email when you send the form to them. So thank you very much to whoever posted that comment.
Very helpful. Okay, so let me go back. There's a couple. So those of you not familiar with Soapbox, the form moves up as more people ask the same question. So I'm just making sure we haven't missed anything out here. The SEEK website does not yet have tentative for forecasted SEEK. Please advise.
It's out there. It's out there now. I'm not sure how long ago they checked. They might have to refresh their browser, but it will say FY 2020-21 SEEK forecast calculations.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to go back down to the bottom. All right.
Tony, we had a
Oh, go ahead.
We had a clarification on text about whether or not the 1062 would satisfy the teacher's contracts, and I guess theoretically it could, depending on what your contract days are, but most likely it would not. You would have extra contract days you would still need for your teachers, and the superintendent asking the question mentioned whether or not emergency days could be used to finish those out, and that could technically be true if your board approved those. However, we want to encourage districts that even if you end your school year for students at when you do that at 1062, you can also go beyond 1062, and if you believe you can do that, then there are needs that kids still need to be met, you can do that as well. But let's say you end at 1062, we want to encourage districts to be thinking outside the box. You can have PD sessions that are available through third-party providers that are available virtually. You can have Microsoft Teams meetings for various employee role groups to satisfy a contract day, and have programming in those team meetings to prepare for next year, to talk about things about this year. Professional learning communities, all of these things can occur virtually. And we also have folks at OET that can assist here at the department, kind of can assist you. And if you're not familiar using some of the virtual platforms, we're happy to help you with that. But we want to encourage districts that just because you hit the 1062 doesn't mean you just have to call it quits and everybody just goes home for the summer. If you have those extra contract days looming out there, we want everybody to act in good faith to try to satisfy those in the various role groups that you have for virtual trainings. There are some of the co-ops that are developing virtual trainings for classified as well as certified that can satisfy some contract days. KEA has an offering through a virtual platform for classified members that are KEA can have that for free and have that satisfy a contract day so long as it's approved by the district. So there are a lot of options that we're hearing about. So I'd encourage you to particularly work with your co-op about some of those alternative methods to help satisfy those contract days without bringing people back into the building.
Okay, and just wanted to give everybody an update on the time. We have about 15 minutes left. We have several questions I think we'll be able to get to, but just to also remind you that the communications department will be putting out a release on this web chat as well, this webcast. And I will attach, when we send this out to everyone, all of our superintendents, I will include all of the finance officers, and I will attach the PowerPoint as well. So you should be able to get a copy of the link, the PowerPoint, and then the summary of this meeting as well. And if you have any questions, you certainly could reach out to me as well there too. So our next question is, we worked very hard this year to become a CEP district for next school year. As of April 1st, we hit the 40% needed. Will our district be considered for a 2020-21 school year on April 15th to be a CEP district?
Yes, this is Lauren. Yes, they will. The USDA has allowed for additional reporting time as well. The date used to be April 1st, so we are just recommending that districts continue to work on the increase for that percentage, and SCN staff, my staff will be continuing to reach out to districts individually to collaborate with them on the best time to report their data.
Okay. Another question is, will summer PD virtually count for the next year if it occurs in June? Do you want to flag that one?
Hi, this is Kelly. That actually comes out of Amanda's office, but Tony, was the question, if you have PD in June, will it count for this year or next year?
Yeah, they specifically virtually. If we have summer PD virtually, will it count for next year if it occurs in June?
Well, typically, if you have it in June, it would count for the 19-20 school year, but we will circle back with Amanda on that. And since you all will have the opportunity to do so much virtually, see if there's any type of waiver request we could grant you on that.
Okay. If our district adds on student in a let me start over. If our district adds a student instructional day to our calendar next year to provide more instruction for students as a result of lost time this year, can the CARES money cover the staffing costs for that day? Again, this is going into the next school year. So to rephrase, it's to cover lost time this year, can they use that money from CARES to cover staffing costs to recoup that time for the next school year?
So Robin, do you want me to kind of address a little bit of what we've talked about in that area?
Yeah, as something we've been kind of batting around. Yeah, I think that's.
Sure. So we don't know the answer to that, but one of the things that I think that we're all going to be faced with are students that need lots of intervention and remediation. And so one of the things that we're going to get clarification on is if that funding could possibly use for summer programs, maybe if you were able to have an intervention program offered in July, or additional days added to your school year next year, or possibly after-school programs. So we're looking into that to see what instructional options would be available for that funding. So that's something that we're going to dig a little deeper into and share back with you when we have a for sure answer.
And that's a good example of thinking outside the box to an expense you may not have had next year, but for this. And I'm not saying that it will end up being signed off on as being covered under that the feds will cover it, but we need to know what you're thinking now so we can ask those questions and again think outside the box about expenses that you foresee the district incurring because of this.
Okay, our next question is CERS going to be increased for 2021 or remain the same as 1920?
Charlie, do you have the amounts for CERS?
Not at my fingertips. I can get them to Tony quickly.
Okay, Charlie, if you could text those to me, that would probably be the quickest and for me to get it easiest without me having to leave my screens here. I feel like there was a question on student devices and NTI, but it seems to have disappeared on my screen. So whoever asked that question, if you can re-ask it so it'll show up at the bottom, that would really be helpful. Let me see what else we have. Okay, there's been a couple of questions of concern about losing SEEK funding because 1819 ADA may be lower than 1920, but won't the difference be made up during the fall growth factor report?
There's a couple of things that can happen, but the short answer is yes. If you have growth in the fall compared to last fall, that's going to work the same way it's worked for many years. So if your district ADA from 1819, which is used in 1920 SEEK, we start the year with that, and then growth is added to that. And we'll know roughly what the number is like November, December, and then the payments will show that in April, May, and June of 2021. And I hope that answers their question.
Okay. All right, again, I'm scrolling up. If you have any more additional questions that I have not seen, I apologize. If you want to add any more questions, we have a few more minutes.
Tony,
Kevin,
I would add,
like
I'm having an offline conversation here with the superintendent. They're providing some good feedback to the question we were addressing earlier about the 1062 and contract days. The superintendent brought up the issue of that his employees are going to be very burned out, by the end of the 1062. And folks from KDE, correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't have to finish necessarily all your contract days, just one right after the other. You could amend your calendar and have some of those scattered out throughout May if you're ending in early May. I know you want to be cognizant of running into certified staff may be going to other summer schools or something like that. But to the extent you're doing this virtually and you do think you have some fatigue issue, you may want to explore spreading those out a little bit to allow some breaks, because we do know doing virtual instruction, and particularly for districts that have never done it, but for everybody, because no one in the state has done it for as long as we're going to be doing it. We understand it is a very grueling and experience for both the staff and students and teachers. So just know that there may be some creative solutions out there to do both things, to recognize the fatigue that may be out there, as well as getting in some virtual PD days. And that's assuming we don't go back to school. Of course, the governor has said there's a small chance we could be back into school, and for those districts that will need to go on into June to get their 1062. But we know we are also planning for the event that we will not be back in.
Okay.
Tony, As we finish up, could I ask you also to pull up I think it's the next to last slide that has contact information?
All right, let me look.
I know we're going to provide this to all of our local superintendents as well as to our finance officers. I just want to make sure that the areas that you may have additional questions, of course, you are always welcome to send in questions to the department. But there is also, I've provided links that might get you to sort of topic questions. We have Kay Kennedy, who is acting as our Office of Finance and Operations Project Manager on the COVID virus questions, as well as trying to coordinate our work to make sure that districts get responses quickly. There's Charlie and Che and Lauren's email addresses, as well as I wanted to provide to you contact information for Matt Ross, who is my policy advisor here in the Office of Finance and Operations. And Matt is working diligently and receiving daily updates on the CARES Act. So he sometimes even has more current information than I do until we talk in the evening. And then just for any district support services, because there's other things, of course, that impact your operations, whether it's audits or school report cards or any of the other things, people transportation, all the other things that district support services traditionally helps you with. There is Donna Duncan's name there also on the contact list. So wanted to make sure that you had those in case that would be helpful as you dig further into certain topics. And then on the very last page, there's my contact information so that if you need to reach out to me, please reach out to me as well. And that 564 number actually is forwarded to my personal cell phone, so that'll get me quickly. Just wanted to make sure that you had that contact information.
Okay, and again, we're going to send this PowerPoint out. I will send it out attached with the video once it's uploaded, in addition to a recap of the webcast here. It'll come out to your inboxes. Give me about an hour and a half, and we'll get it out to you all. So let me stop sharing so I can get back to the soapbox, because there was at least one more question on there that I saw that we did not get to, about $100 per student or something, and it disappeared. Hold on.
That was probably about SBDM.
Well, I think they were asking if they could just go ahead. There it is. Do you suggest we give $100 per student instead of the maximum allowed? And I don't know if that was addressed during the budget or, and we can mark that one and get that one back. I don't know.
Tony?
Yes.
This is Charlie. I would still say that's a district decision. The budget bill allows for a minimum of $100. So that's just the requirement. It's going to be district by district and maybe even school by school what districts decide to do.
Okay. And then there was a clarifying question here. Did you say that CSI schools will not get additional funding? Kelly, are you still on?
Yes, I'm on. So if you're currently a CSI school and have a school improvement grant, you will continue to have that grant. Many of you have just completed your turnaround plans, and I believe you have a webinar on Friday to talk about applying for school improvement funds that will become eligible. You'll become eligible for on July 1. So if you are identified as a CSI for the first time during the 1920 school year, you've got a webinar at the end of the week about those funds, and you'll receive those funds July 1. If you are a second year as a CSI school, then you will be having a webinar about some continuation funds on top of what you've already been awarded. And there will be an extension, and we'll talk about that Friday on the webinar. There is an extension. We applied for a waiver before any of this started to have a little bit more time to spend those funds. So we'll talk about that on Friday as well.
Okay. And then I do see the question about the NT item. I appreciate somebody resubmitting the question. Do you think the purchase of student devices to help with students with NTI will be an eligible expense for CARES?
This is Robin. I do think that is an eligible expense. Of course, I'm going to spend the last minute channeling David Couch because David would remind us that purchasing of those technology devices is good so long as you have the qualified technical staff to support those. So I just want to make that pitch and channel David Couch as we end our program today.
Okay.
And
And David Couch never took less than a minute to say anything.
this is Kelly. I would also say look at your Title IV funds. There'll be some new guidance coming out about extension of those funds, and you can also tap into those for technology devices.
Great.
Speaking, and Tony, I can close this out. We're right at 4 o'clock.
Perfect.
And speaking of David Couch, I want to also thank every team at KDE, all the offices, but I was talking to David earlier today, and we were talking about how it has been relatively easy for us to switch over to telecommuting during this time, and that's because of the foundation that David and his team, they've laid this for 25 years and we've built upon it. And I know that technology is in place in your districts because of the same devotion that David and his team have had at OET for all these years, and we are there are many states that can't say the same, and we're hearing from our colleagues in other states that are having technological hiccups, and not that we don't have a few hiccups here and there, but we are very well positioned. And so I want to thank David and his team and the whole team at KDE. I want to thank everybody in the districts for what you're doing. I'll leave you with two thoughts. If you don't take away anything from the webinar today, take away that we need you to apply for the request for public assistance under the FEMA provisions by April 13th. Again, that's just to get your district's name in the hopper for potential assistance under that one federal program for disaster relief. May or may not end up qualifying. We want to make sure you get your name in the hopper by April 13th. There's a slide on that. And then the second thing, the next superintendent webcast is tentatively scheduled for a week from today, April 14th, 2 to 4. It will most likely be a general Q&A session, or we'll obviously have issues come up that we don't even know about yet, probably between now and then, that we'll discuss. We're getting a few questions, I think, on superintendent required due dates. We didn't really address that today, but we'll put that on the list to address on the April 14th webinar, if folks can go ahead and make a note of that, and we'll start working on those questions. So thanks to everyone for what you're doing. Have a great rest of the week and a great weekend. We're here if you need anything. Feel free to call, text, or email us.